And I'm here to talk about Muslim representation in video games. This is the end part of this talk is a how-to guide. I see at least one familiar face here. Thank you for showing up. So this is who I am. I'm Muslim. I'm born in Iraq, and I've been living in Canada for all of my adult life and most of my life. I work at Warner Brothers Games, Dawson College, and I founded the Montreal Independent Games Festival, and I'm in indie dev as well. And these are some of the games I worked on. Fast forwarding through that, what is this talk about? It's an explanation of why positive Muslim representation in video games is important. It's also a brief explanation of what Islam is and isn't. But both of these things can be their own very long full-day talks. So I'm just going to go over it briefly. The meat of it is actionable advice. How to incorporate Muslims into games in a meaningful way. So that's going to be the bulk of the presentation. What I'm not going to go into is, I'm not here to convince you that not all Muslims are bad. If you need convincing of this, come see me later, and hopefully that's going to be a different conversation. But I'm going to assume that everyone here is on board with that. And it's also not about shaming people or companies who have misrepresented Muslims in the past. The truth is, I've actually worked on games that have misrepresented Muslims. This is something that most of the time I feel that this comes from a place of ignorance and not malicious or ill will. So there's no judgment here if you have or haven't or whatnot. So why is it important? Islamophobia is on the rise. It spiked during 9/11 and kind of died down, and during the elections it kind of rose up again. These are most of the places that Islamophobia takes place. Mostly it's on the street. Most of the victims are women. Most of the perpetrators are men. And 10% of the cases are of extreme violence, even death. 15% of North American Muslims' children hide their faith. And I was one of these in my youth. The reason, basically, it's because Muslims have a public image problem. And it's what the speaker said before in the panel. People don't know Muslims. And because they don't know Muslims, they believe the stereotypes. Every group has its stereotypes, especially from other groups, and that's the issue at hand. And it's actually dangerous to be Muslim in many cases. I'd like to tell you a story that happened to me when I was very young. I went to a friend's house who was a student in my school, and his mom smilingly brought us some ham sandwiches. As a Muslim, I don't eat ham. And I was in a very uncomfortable situation because I know that this sandwich came from a place of love and the woman had only the best intentions, but I couldn't eat it. And I was too shy or uncomfortable to actually ask her to make me another sandwich. So I just said, I'm not hungry, and I sat hungry for a few hours until I went home and ate something else. This is an analogy for my talk. I don't expect that this woman had any bad intentions at all. I don't think anybody does. The intention here is to explain beforehand, before we present ham sandwiches to the Muslim community and misrepresent them. That is all. In the 2016, last year's elections in the United States, there were a lot of politicians that made some well-meaning mistakes. Of course, I'm not talking about this guy because everything he says is poop. Who I am talking about is these two, someone that you would expect better of. So I'll take a moment to read this out. If we're to succeed in defeating terrorism, we must enlist Muslim communities as some of our strongest allies, rather than put them away through suspicion and hate. We need to be cooperating with Muslim nations and with the American Muslim community. They're on the front lines. They can provide information to us that we might not get anywhere else. So I'm here to tell you that I'm not on any front lines. I've never met a terrorist. I don't know where to find one. I've been Muslim my whole life. I've been active in the Muslim community as well as in the video game community. I go to mosques all the time. I've never met a terrorist. So no, we're not in the front lines. You cannot enlist me, and I cannot be your ally in this. I don't know how. This is a tweet that went viral by a British Muslim teenager. For better or worse, he says, I don't understand why non-Muslims think we British Muslims can stop ISIS. I can't even get a text back from the girl I like, and you expect me to stop a terrorist organization? I mean, for better or worse, this is the kind of things Muslims are dealing with. Regular, everyday things. We're just living our lives. So you don't need us to be your allies. We need you to be ours. In the movie The Three Kings, it's a situation where there are Americans in Iraq, and in order to justify that situation, there's a scene. It's a little bit graphic, so if you, if this scenes of violence could be a little bit rough for you, I would ask you to avert your eyes for just a moment. But there's this scene where a woman of Iraqi descent was shot point blank in front of the audience, basically. This is actually true. I mean, 97% of the victims of terrorism are Muslim. But the issue at hand is if we're always representing Muslims as victims in these movies, in these situations, we are telling people that we must go kill Muslims that kill Muslims. And if we're there and Muslims die, well, isn't that why we're there to begin with? It creates this mixed, ambiguous message. So solely portraying Muslims as victims actually justifies the wars that make us victims. Take that to another level. There's a movie called The Siege that takes place actually before September 11, and it's about a terrorist event that takes place in New York. And in this movie, of course, the terrorists are Muslims, and one of the CIA agents is Muslim as well. And the situation that happens is that he is drinking alcohol. He's not particularly religious. He doesn't look like the other Muslims, which is not a problem by itself. The issue here is that every terrorist was portrayed as being very religious, and he was the exception. So this sends the message that you can be Muslim, but not too Muslim. This is a graph, because some people like graphs. They don't understand it any other way. Some Muslims practice more than others, and that's okay. Let people decide their own level of engagement in spirituality and involvement. So don't create these associations. That's it. If people want to be less religious, totally okay. Don't necessarily paint them as the good guys or even the bad guys. Now, I'd like to take a little bit of time to debunk a few misconceptions. This is a graph of where Muslims generally live in the world. Of course, there are Muslims everywhere. I'm living here as well. But density-wise, this is where Muslims live. Fewer than 15% of Muslims are Arab. So this could be shocking to most. Most Arabs are Muslim. There are a lot of Christian and Jewish Muslims, but most Muslims are not Arab. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, a country you never hear about, ever. It's very peaceful, doesn't have oil, and that's why you probably don't hear about it. Muslims in India number 172 million people. So the Muslims in India alone are almost as much as the Muslims in all of the Arab Peninsula combined. And they account for, 14% of the Muslim population, give or take. So the image that you have of this parallel between Muslims and Arabs, it's actually very skewed. It's not realistic, it's not real. So what do Muslims look like? What does a Christian look like? What does an atheist look like? What does a vegan look like? What does anyone look like, right? You probably conjured up an image in your mind when I asked what does a Muslim look like. It probably looked like something like this, with varying degrees of dress, right? This is actually, as I showed before in the past, a small representations of what Muslims look like. If you're more well-traveled, then the image would probably look more like this. And you could see a lot of different, skin tones and different cultures. But the reality is, Muslims also look like this. Muslims can look like anyone. Spoiler. So I'd like to play a game. I call this game 50 Shades of Brown. I'm going to show you an image, and by show of hands, I'm going to ask you to tell me if this image represents a Muslim or not. So this is the first. No hands. Good. This is a Sikh. Nope. Okay. Hindu. One hand. I'm not going to point out. No, because if I start pointing out, no one's going to raise their hand anymore. No, this is a Christian, an Arab Christian. Ethiopian Jew. Maybe. Same person. Could be Buddhist. The truth is, all of these people come from countries that have very large populations of Muslims. Any one of them could have been Muslims, and the difference in their attire is in small details. Muslims wear turbans, Muslims wear saris, Muslims come from Arab countries, Muslims wear head coverings, but so do other people. And from this country, in these countries, it's very difficult sometimes to tell a Muslim from a non-Muslim. Just like when a Muslim is in North America, generally, depending on how many generations they've been here, it becomes harder and harder to tell that they're Muslims. Like, can you necessarily tell if I'm Muslim if I'm walking down the street? You might not, and that's normal. So Muslims are diverse, not unlike non-Muslims. So now I jump into the heart of the talk, which is the how-to guide, step-by-step advice. I'd like to start by saying that a lot of the examples that I give here are mostly from other mediums than video games, and there's a very good reason for that. We have very few good examples from video games to draw from, and I'd like to bring examples that at least some of you know of, so that's why. So this is Kamala Khan. She's from a comic book character from the Marvel universe, Miss Marvel. She was created by two Muslim women, G. Willow Wilson and Sana Amanat. And Kamala Khan is a phenomenon. She's the character Muslims growing up here have all been waiting for. And what's really interesting about it is that she's of Pakistani descent, she's a teenage girl, and yet when I read the comics, I felt like she was closer to my experience growing up than any other character that I've ever read. And that's shocking to me as a person who's not a woman and not Pakistani. But the parallels of her growing up with parents who are of a certain tradition and certain cultures were incredible. And this only was possible because the authors actually lived my experience. Even if other people try to do to accomplish the same thing, it's extremely hard for them to understand what it is in the nuances, in the details, in the small things. So let us have a voice, and you're going to come up with something that nobody else has. And right now, especially right now, you're going to find success because the comics are selling at an incredible rate. When they first created Kamala Khan, they only had plans for the first 3 issues because they expected the comic to fail. But it's the opposite. The way business works, supply and demand. There's a big demand, there was no supply, and it sold like hotcakes. And it's actually a really good comic. The second piece of advice I'd like to tell you is talk to us. The biggest fear is that people are afraid to ask Muslims, and this could be said of any small minority group, but they're afraid to ask because they find that asking is offensive. But if you think about it, it's more offensive not to ask your coworkers who are Muslim and to misrepresent them. It's actually, it's a no-brainer, but it takes a while for that to sink in. So please think about it. If you're going to represent any group of people who you don't belong to, speak to them first, especially if they're part of your team. The second is, don't stack tokens. And what I mean by this is if you're not going to get brownie points for having one character that is part of every misrepresented group. And if the rest of your cast is just like white males, that's not how representation works. So don't have a character who's a lesbian, Muslim, paraplegic. I mean, it's fine to have that character if it's your main character, if you have someone who can tell that story. I mean, that's an interesting character to have. But don't think, okay, I checked off these 3 boxes and I could move on. That's the issue with this scenario. And if you do have a character who actually has many of these different traits, then try your best to find someone who's lived as many of those as possible, or at least gather people who fit those different criteria into a room and let them have a discussion. That's how you get to this. Otherwise, it's going to feel flat. I mean, your intention might be good, but the end result will be stacked tokens. So, insist on authentic voice overs. I mean, when I was really young, I was just happy to see any kind of Muslim or I'm Arab, so Arab representation in the media. But even at a very young age, I can tell when a person doesn't sound like me. It makes a huge difference. We'll take the example of the character Anna from Overwatch, who was voiced by an Egyptian living in Egypt, who is of appropriate age, which is something we should mention as well, which that rarely happens. And it's incredible. I mean, I listen to her, I can pretty much tell what city she's from in Egypt. It's out of this world. On top of that, what it does is it really makes her stand out from the other characters. You'll never mistake Anna for anyone else. If you have a roster of characters, add us to the roster. And what I mean by this is add someone from a Muslim majority country. I mean, I don't particularly know if Hakan is Muslim, for example, but he comes from Turkey, and that's enough, really. It doesn't, when you represent someone from another mostly Christian country, you don't highlight the fact that they're Christian either, so represent us in exactly the same way. I mean, when was the last time we saw an Indonesian video game character? I can't name one. Add us as NPCs. So this is Farida Malik from the Deus Ex series, and this is Sarah Hamdi from Tacoma. And both of these characters are extremely important to the story. They stand on their own, and one of their traits is that they're Muslim. And this trait is just, it's mentioned almost in passing. Yes, it formed their character and who they are, but they're not throwing it in your face. Now, this is from a movie called Robin Hood from the 90s. The character is Azim, and why I wanted to highlight is Muslim representation, for it to be good, doesn't mean that the character has to be incredibly virtuous. Azim was actually an exile for a crime that we don't really know about. But that doesn't really matter because he has his own moral code and he's a positive representation otherwise, except when it came to one specific part. When he came down to pray, the prayer that he did was just, it seems like it was conjured up from the memory of the director. It wasn't something, like our rituals are actually very specific. So the advice to you is if you're not going to do the research, just leave it out. It's fine, we won't care. But if you're going to represent our rituals, don't do it from memory or, inauthentically. And again, that goes for any, my Native American friends say that that's their biggest pet peeve of representation of Native Americans. Character customization is another avenue that you have in order to give Muslims some representation. So this is Farah from Overwatch, and this is the first time that a video game character in a major franchise was represented with hijab. This is a tweet from Jasmine Kills You. Her Twitter name is Jasmine Loves You, but I guess this was during Halloween or something. So Farah is wearing a hijab. I'm a Muslim. You don't know how much this means to me. I've been waiting all my life. All Muslims have been waiting all our lives for this kind of representation. And this is a skin option, so people can turn it on and off as they wish. What was really interesting about this is it's actually very authentic to the Bedouins who lived in Egypt, so they actually did their research, which brings me to my next point. Okay, before I do that, Jasmine Kills You is a big fan of Miss Marvel. So you see, there's not that much media out there, so Muslims are going to be consuming it every time that they're represented. The research that's important is because representation of specifically head coverings for women is very tied to the culture of where the women are from. So if you're going to represent Muslim women from any different country, just do a little bit of research to find out where that is. The second point is if you're going to offer character customization options, then the research is much less important. As long as you don't tie it to a culture, you could do anything you want. It's just an option of a dress at this point. So like if you want to make colorful hijabs or like have beanies on top of them that spin or anything like that, don't be scared. This is an option that a person can wear or not wear as they deem fit. As long as you don't label it a thing, it's just a head covering. So have fun with it. Now, can anyone tell me what country this represents? I'm not going to talk about which game it's in. That's not the point. Generic. I call it Arabistan. It could be any Middle Eastern or Southeast Asian country, right? What's unique about it, or not so unique about it, is that it's just rubble. It's war-torn, right? What this does actually is desensitizes people. So when they see images of Syria before the war and after the war, they don't recognize the before. But the after the war is something they've played in, they've experienced. And, they're there to shoot people. So if a stray bullet hits someone else, it's collateral damage. It desensitizes. So please avoid having Arabistans in your world. This is a tweet from a friend of mine, Nicolas Barrière, who actually is also a game designer in Montreal. He says, for your information, Overwatch's new map, Oasis, is set in Iraq. Good to see visions of futures that glorify the Middle East instead of the usual depictions. Just told this to my Iraqi-Canadian friend, colleague, and game design mentor, and he legit choked up. Spoiler, that person he told it to was me. So I was at work, and he comes to me, and I play Overwatch, but I don't, follow the news. And he showed up, and he said, hey, did you see Iraq in Overwatch? I'm like, what are you even talking about? When he showed me the images, I teared up at work, because I've never, a person who thinks about representation all the time, who thinks about this all the time, and I never conjured up a positive image of my own country of birth in my life. Like, I'd never projected a positive future. And this came from a video game. So representation is incredibly important. And I guess that's where we need you to amplify our voices. And we need you to include us. And that's it. Thank you.
To your point of, where I work, we have several Muslims that work in just the day-to-day, and we have an Eid celebration where they bring in a bunch of food to office and invite everyone in the office to Eid. And the point of that is for us to all just come together and celebrate, even though that might not be something that, you know, we're celebrating in our religious faith, but it's just an opportunity, like an outreach. And I've learned so much about the Muslim culture just because of the people that I work with every day, because they just offer it in a really threatening way, where we just eat, and then they say, do you have any questions? And, well, why are we celebrating this? And then you learn about Ramadan, and you learn about all these things. So I think, to your point, I mean, I'm very fortunate that I know some amazing people who are Muslim, and so now I feel like I defend some of your opening stuff a lot more, where it's like,
thank you.
They're not all terrorists. In fact, I haven't met one yet.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, people who know me know that every Eid I bring pastries at my desk, so they kind of swarm over at work.
Do you have any ideas for maybe Muslim-oriented game mechanics?
Game mechanics? Yeah. Well, do you have any for any Christian-oriented game mechanics?
Maybe prayer.
I would, to be quite honest, I would leave that to Muslims to figure out. I mean, there's a really cool game that came out not too long ago about Islamic calligraphy and how you're able to do these really interesting Islamic designs. But I mean, it's something that you need to dive a little bit deep into the culture and history to be able to understand. In terms of mechanics, I mean, I would not represent prayer in a video game form personally. It's a matter of opinion. Other Muslims will give you different things, different opinions, and that's not wrong at all. But I would avoid it. I'm sorry, I know that's not probably the answer that you're looking for.
No, I was just curious.
But yeah, it's err on the side of caution in that sense. Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions?
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question for you about the premise that started this that you didn't delve into, which is that the Muslims are the bad guys, or the terrorists, et cetera, in the storytelling. And I want to get your thoughts about that, how we overcome that sort of laziness in storytelling, right? For a long time, all our bad guys were German, and then they all became Russian, and now they're all Muslim. So how do you overcome that kind of laziness in storytelling?
I actually have a little bit of a story for that. When I worked at a company that I will not name, I actually worked on a game that's kind of similar to Call of Duty, and the enemies were Muslim because it was the easy solution. Video games tend to copy whatever Hollywood is doing. I don't know why it is that we do that, but that's the case. That game went through 6 different iterations. So every year we came up with a version 2 and a version 3 and a version 4. And I picked away at the most offensive things from the inside until eventually Muslims were not the antagonists anymore. I'm not quite sure which of my strategies actually convinced them to move away from it, but I tried everything. I tried reasoning, I tried showing examples, but in the end, the biggest issue, I think, is broader than just video games, and people tend to mimic what others are doing. So as we have more conversations like this, and we explain to people that this is mostly politics, and the good guys of today will be the enemies of tomorrow, and vice versa, I think it'll be easier for people to do better in the future. Most of the people I spoke to, I mean, on my team who were pushing for this, they weren't malicious at all. And they use the same examples of, but there are terrorists that are Muslim, so this is okay. They don't understand what kind of message that pushes through, and they don't understand that okay, if you're just showing one point of view of this, you're actually making it very difficult for other people to show the other point of view. So whether you know it or not, you're actually taking a side. But in the end, to be quite honest, I'm not quite sure what convinced them. But I do know that from version 3 to version 4, the enemies became non-denominational of many different colors, and it's still like that to this day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.